Before the story unfolds, tell me, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it there? Is the sun just rising over Nairobi, or has midnight taken hold in New York? Perhaps it's afternoon in Canada, or evening in France. Wherever you are, don't stay silent. Leave your mark below. Now, let the story begin. The wind came off the Wyoming ridge like a blade, and Odessa Marrow was dying on her feet. Snow packed her eyelashes shut. Her lips had cracked open hours ago, and now the blood on them had frozen into a dark, brittle crust. She had walked 11 miles since the wagon wheel snapped, and her husband's body went cold beside it. She did not remember the last mile. She only remembered falling and the world going the color of milk. A shape moved through the whiteout. Boots, a long grey coat, a man's voice, rough as gravel, cutting through the storm. Ma'am, look at me." Odessa could not lift her head. Her fingers had stopped answering her. The man knelt in the snow before her, and for one terrible second she thought he meant to rob her, or worse, and leave her where she lay. Instead, he tore his own coat from his shoulders. His name was Bartholomew Quill, though no one in the territory called him that. They called him Quill, or sometimes nothing at all, because a rancher who talks to no one earns no nicknames. He wrapped the coat around Odessa's shaking body without a word of explanation, without asking her name, without asking why a woman was half buried in a blizzard 11 miles from the nearest roof. He simply acted the way a man acts when hesitation means a corpse by morning. What Quill did not know, what no one in that storm could have known, was that they were being watched. 50 yards off, pressed flat against the trunk of a lightning-split pine, an Apache warrior named Istaqa held his bow at full draw. An arrow nocked and aimed square at Quill's spine. Istaqa had followed this man for 3 days. He had a reason, and the reason was blood. His arrow had killed men for less than what Quill had done to his family the summer before. Or so Istaqa believed, and belief in that killing cold was as sharp as any blade. Istaqa's arm trembled, not from cold, but from the terrible closeness of the moment. One release, one breath, and the man who had haunted his dreams for 6 moons would be dead in the snow beside a stranger he was trying to save. Istaqa's finger tightened on the string. Then he saw it, the way Quill's bare hands shook violently now that the coat was gone, the way he lifted the freezing woman as if she weighed nothing, the way his own lips had already begun to turn blue. This was not the man from Istaqa's memory, or it was, and something had cracked him open since. Istaqa did not understand it yet, only that the picture in front of him did not match the picture in his chest. The arrow stayed nocked. His hand did not release. Somewhere behind gritted teeth, Istaqa made a choice that would change 4 lives forever. He lowered the bow just an inch, just enough. And in that inch, everything after was written. Quill did not know how close death had come. He only knew the woman in his arms was still breathing barely, and that the line shack 2 miles east was the only shelter between them and the grave. He began to walk, carrying a stranger through a storm that had already claimed 1 life that night, unaware that another man's mercy, a warrior's mercy, was the only reason he still had legs to walk on. Behind the pine, Istaqa slung his bow and began silently to follow. 3 weeks before the blizzard, Bartholomew Quill had been a different kind of man, harder, quieter, a rancher who spoke to his cattle more than his neighbors. His spread sat at the base of Split Antler Ridge, 300 acres of hard grass and harder winters, inherited from a father who had died the same way most men in that country died, alone and too soon. Quill had built walls around himself brick by brick since childhood, and by 31 those walls had no windows left. Then came the night the Larkin gang rode through, burning barns for sport and calling it justice against squatters. Quill's northern fence line bordered land the Apache band, led by Istaqa's father, had lived on for 2 generations. Land the territory had promised, then quietly forgotten to protect. The Larkin gang did not distinguish between rancher and native that night. They burned both. Istaqa's mother died in that fire. So did 2 of Quill's prize horses, and though Quill had lost far less, guilt does not measure itself by inches. Istaqa had seen a rider in a grey coat near the tree line the night of the fire, a rider who looked, in smoke and terror, exactly like Quill. It was a mistake born of chaos and grief, the kind of mistake that hardens into certainty when a man is drowning in loss. Istaqa swore before his father's grave that he would find the rider in the grey coat and make him answer for it. He did not know yet that the real riders wore red bandanas and rode east, laughing, while an innocent man slept 3 miles away, unaware he'd been marked for death. Quill, for his part, had spent those 3 weeks trying to make sense of a fire he hadn't started and couldn't explain. He rode the boundary between his land and the Apache camp daily, leaving what he could: flour, a spare rifle, mended blankets, tied to a fence post, a silent apology for a crime that was not his. He never saw who took the offerings. He never knew he was being watched each time, studied by a grieving son, deciding whether an apology could ever be enough. The gifts were not enough for Istaqa. Grief rarely listens to logic. He began to track Quill in earnest, learning his patrol routes, learning the hours he rode alone, learning exactly where a man might be caught unarmed and undefended. Vengeance, Istaqa told himself, was not the same as murder. It was balance. It was the mother he'd buried speaking through his hands. He told no one in his camp what he planned because he suspected, rightly, that his father would have forbidden it. It was on the 4th day of tracking that the storm rolled in without warning, the kind of Wyoming blizzard that swallows landmarks whole. Istaqa nearly lost Quill's trail twice. He did not know that Quill, riding home from town, had come across a broken-down wagon and a half-frozen widow named Odessa Marrow, whose husband had died trying to fix a wheel in the worsening snow. He did not know that the next hour would test everything he believed about the man in the grey coat and about himself. By the time Istaqa reached the ridge where Quill knelt in the snow beside a dying stranger, his bow was already drawn. He had rehearsed this moment for 3 weeks. He had told himself it would feel like justice. What he had not rehearsed was the sight of the very man he hated giving away the only warmth he had to a woman who was not his wife, not his kin, not his responsibility, for no reason Istaqa could name except that she was cold and he was not. Odessa Marrow had not always been a widow walking alone through Wyoming snow. 6 months earlier, she had been a schoolteacher in Ohio with a husband named Elias and a small savings ledger that promised a new life out west. Land of their own, a schoolhouse for her to run, a future free of her father's debts. Elias had read her the letters from the land office by lamplight, his voice bright with a hope Odessa had not felt since she was a girl. She had believed every word of it. The land they'd bought sight unseen turned out to be a lie, sold twice over, a swindler's plot with no water rights, and a boundary dispute already 3 years deep. By the time they discovered it, they had nothing left to go back to. Elias, proud and desperate in equal measure, insisted they push on to the territorial capital to file a claim on better ground. It was on that final stretch, in a storm the almanac had not predicted, that the wagon wheel gave out on a frozen grade, and Elias went out into the dark to fix it alone. He did not come back. Odessa waited 2 hours before the cold forced her to go looking, and what she found by lantern light broke something in her that would take longer than this story to mend. She left his body wrapped in the one blanket they had left because she could not carry him and could not carry herself much farther either. She started walking toward a light she thought she saw on the ridge, not knowing if it was a house or a trick of her freezing mind. It was neither. It was Bartholomew Quill's lantern, hung on a fence post the way he hung it every night out of a habit his father had taught him. Light for lost travelers, an old ranching custom nearly forgotten in that hard country. Odessa never would have found him without it. She collapsed within sight of that lantern, certain she would die within reach of help, and still somehow unable to close the last 50 yards. It was there Quill found her, half buried, and made the choice that would put an arrow's aim upon his back. What neither of them could have guessed, kneeling in that snow, was that Istaqa had once received the very same courtesy from Odessa's husband weeks earlier on the road when Elias had shared his own coat with an Apache elder caught in a sudden hailstorm, expecting nothing in return. Istaqa had heard the story second-hand from the elder, a small act of decency in a summer otherwise full of cruelty. He had not connected that story to the dying woman below him now. Grief has a way of blinding even careful men to the threads that connect strangers. Odessa did not know, as Quill lifted her, that her husband's small kindness months before had planted a seed that might now save her life. She only knew warmth and the sound of a stranger's heart beat through his shirt, and the terrible fear that she was already too far gone to matter. Behind them, Istaqa's bow lowered another inch, though he could not yet have said why. Something about the shape of the moment refused to fit the shape of his hatred, no matter how hard he tried to force it. The three of them, hunter, rescuer, and the woman between them, were converging on a single line shack 2 miles east, none of them yet understanding that the night was not finished testing them, and that the coldest hour was still ahead. The shack was a single room built for emergencies, not comfort. 4 log walls, a rusted stove, and a woodpile that had not been touched since autumn. Quill kicked the door open with his boot, Odessa still cradled against his chest, and laid her on the narrow cot nearest the stove. His hands, already numb, fumbled twice before he got a fire going. He did not think about his missing coat. He thought only of the woman's lips, which had gone from blue toward a gray he had seen before on his father. At the very end, "Stay with me," he said, not knowing if she could hear him. "You hear me? Stay." Odessa's eyes fluttered open just enough to find his face, unfamiliar, weathered, lit orange by the growing fire, before slipping shut again. Quill worked fast, piling every blanket in the shack over her, rubbing warmth back into her hands, even as his own fingers screamed in protest. He had seen frostbite take fingers before. He had seen cold take lives faster than any bullet. He was not going to let it take hers, not after everything else it had already taken that night. Outside, Istaqa crouched in the lee of the shack wall, close enough to hear muffled voices through the timber, too conflicted to leave, and too proud to walk through the door. His bow hung loose at his side now, forgotten in a way it had never been forgotten in 3 weeks of careful hunting. He told himself he was only confirming the man's guilt, gathering proof before the final act. But the truth pressing at the edges of his mind was harder to admit. He no longer knew what he had come to do. Inside, Quill discovered the second half of the tragedy when he searched Odessa's coat pocket for anything that might tell him who she was, hoping to find family nearby who could be sent for. Instead, he found a folded letter, half frozen, addressed to a land office and a small tintype photograph of a man Quill recognized instantly. Elias Marrow. Quill had passed his frozen body on the ridge not 2 hours earlier, half buried already, and had assumed him a stranger lost to the same storm that nearly claimed them all. Now the dead man had a name and a wife, breathing weakly 6 feet away. The weight of it staggered him. He had carried a dying widow past her own husband's body without knowing it, and there was no way, no gentle way, to tell her what waited for her outside once the storm broke. Quill sat back against the log wall, the tintype trembling in his frost-bitten hand, and for the first time that hard winter, something in his chest cracked open that had nothing to do with cold. He thought of his own father, dying alone on frozen ground years before, and understood suddenly the particular cruelty of surviving a night that someone you loved did not. Outside, Istaqa heard the sudden silence change texture, heard something in it that sounded less like danger and more like sorrow. He pressed his eye to a gap between the logs and saw Quill sitting with his head bowed, a photograph shaking in his hand, guarding a stranger's grief instead of guarding himself. It did not look like the posture of a murderer. It looked, Istaqa thought with a jolt he did not want to feel, like the posture of a man who had spent his whole life quietly trying to fix things he had not broken. For the first time since his mother's death, Istaqa lowered himself to sit against the outside wall, bow across his knees, and did not know whether he was still hunting Quill or simply keeping watch over him now, the way a warrior keeps watch over something he has not yet decided to spare. By midnight, Odessa's fever broke into shaking chills so violent Quill feared she would tear the blankets apart. He had seen this before too, the body fighting its way back from the edge, unsure which direction to fall. He pressed a damp cloth to her forehead and spoke to her steadily, the way he might gentle a spooked horse, though he had no memory of ever using this voice on a person before. "You're not done yet," he told her. "Whoever you are, you're not done yet." Odessa's eyes opened, clearer now, though rimmed red with exhaustion. "Elias," she whispered, and Quill's stomach dropped, because he understood at once she was asking, not remembering. He could not bring himself to answer with the truth. Not yet, not while her body still fought so hard just to keep breathing. "Rest," he said instead, hating the coward's mercy of it even as he offered it. She searched his face a moment longer, some instinct in her recognizing the evasion, before her eyes slid shut again into a safer, deeper sleep. Outside, the storm had not eased, and Istaqa had made a decision of his own. He circled to the woodpile at the rear of the shack, and working silently in the dark, began splitting logs. Quill had been too occupied to gather himself. It was not friendship. Istaqa told himself firmly it was not friendship, only a debt owed to whatever unnamed instinct had stayed his arrow, and a warrior's refusal to let 2 strangers freeze while he crouched outside deciding what kind of man he wanted to be. Quill heard the thud of the axe through the wall and froze, hand going instinctively to the revolver at his hip, empty of coat, empty of comfort, cold steel against a colder night. He crossed to the door and opened it a crack, revolver raised, expecting an ambush. Instead, he found stacked wood at the threshold and no one in sight, only boot prints already filling with snow, leading off into the dark toward the tree line. He stood there a long moment, confused by a kindness with no face attached to it, before hauling the wood inside. He did not know Istaqa's name. He did not know an arrow had been aimed at his back 2 hours earlier. He knew only that something strange and watchful moved through that storm alongside them, and that twice now it had chosen mercy over harm without explanation. It unsettled him more than an enemy would have. An enemy at least made sense. This did not. Quill built the fire higher, checked Odessa's breathing one more time, and sat back against the wall to keep watch. through what remained of the night, revolver in his lap, eyes on the door. Somewhere in the trees, Istaqa sat with his back against bark, gone white with frost, turning his mother's memory over in his mind like a stone worn smooth by a river. He thought of the fire that had taken her. He thought of the rider in grey he had convinced himself was Quill. He thought of the wood he had just split for a man he still, by every law of his grief, should have killed. Somewhere between hatred and doubt, exhaustion finally took him, and for the first time in 3 weeks, Istaqa slept without dreaming of vengeance. Dawn broke pale and merciless over Split Antler Ridge. The storm finally spent. The world outside scoured white and silent. Odessa woke first this time. Her fever gone, her strength returning in fragile pieces. She found Quill asleep sitting upright against the wall, revolver still loose in his hand, dark circles carved beneath his eyes from a night spent standing guard over a stranger. For a moment she simply watched him, trying to understand what kind of man gave away his coat to a woman he'd never met, and then stayed awake all night to make sure she lived. When Quill woke to find her studying him, something passed between them that neither had words for yet. Recognition, maybe, of 2 people who had each expected to die in that storm and had not. It was Odessa who broke the silence, asking the question Quill had been dreading since he found the tintype in her pocket. "Where is my husband?" Her voice was steady, but her eyes already held the shape of the answer, the way a person braces before a blow they've half seen coming. Quill told her plainly, because he had learned young that gentle lies only prolong cruelty. He told her about the wagon, the wheel, the mile marker where he'd passed a man's body in the snow without knowing his name. He watched grief take her all over again, this time with the clarity of a woman fully conscious to feel it, and he did not try to soften it or rush her through it. He simply sat with her, the way someone had once sat with him after his own father died, saying nothing useful, offering only presence. Outside, Istaqa woke, stiff with cold, and immediately alert to the changed quality of the morning. No wind, no snow, only the brittle stillness that follows a storm's end. He crept close to the shack again, curiosity now outweighing caution, and through the same gap in the logs, he watched Odessa weep into her hands while Quill sat beside her, not touching her, not speaking, simply present. Istaqa had expected to find deceit in that shack. Instead, he found something that looked uncomfortably like decency, and it left him no room left to hide behind his old certainty. It was in that moment Istaqa made his choice. He stepped back from the wall, walked to the front of the shack in full view, and rapped twice on the door with the flat of his hand. Not the knock of an ambush, but a warrior's announcement, deliberate and unhidden. Inside, Quill rose instantly, revolver drawn, and pulled the door open to find not an enemy but a young Apache man standing in the snow, empty-handed, bow slung harmlessly across his back, eyes steady and unreadable. "You gave her your coat," Istaqa said, his English careful and precise, learned from a missionary school he'd hated but survived. It was not a question. Quill lowered the revolver slowly, some instinct telling him this was not the moment for weapons. "She was dying," Quill answered simply, as if that explained everything, because to him it did. Istaqa studied his face a long moment, searching for the lie he had spent 3 weeks certain he would find there, and found none. "I have been hunting you," he said finally, "for a fire I believed you set." The confession hung in the cold air between them, and for a moment Quill did not understand it. The words arrived too plainly for what they described. "Hunting me," he repeated. Istaqa nodded once, his jaw tight, and told him about the fire at Split Antler Ridge, about the rider in grey glimpsed through smoke, about his mother who had not made it out, about 3 weeks spent tracking a man he believed responsible for a grief that had hollowed him out from the inside. Quill felt the ground shift beneath the story, not because he doubted Istaqa's pain, but because he recognized it exactly, having carried a version of the same guilt himself since that night. "I lost horses in that fire," he said quietly. "I didn't lose more because I was 3 miles south, mending fence, when the Larkin gang came through wearing red bandanas and laughing about squatters." He watched the information land on Istaqa's face like a physical blow, the careful hatred of 3 weeks colliding with a truth that demanded it be rebuilt from nothing. Odessa, still wrapped in blankets on the cot, listened in silence, understanding without being told that she was witnessing something larger than her own grief. 2 men discovering that the enemy they'd each been shaped by loss to see was not standing in front of them at all. Istaqa's hands, which had held a bow steady through half a night of hatred, now hung loose and uncertain at his sides. "I saw a grey coat," he said, almost to himself. "In the smoke, I was certain. Half the ranchers in this territory wear grey coats in winter," Quill said, not unkindly, understanding now exactly how close he had come to dying for a color of wool. "Grief picks the nearest shape and calls it a villain. I did the same thing after my father died. Blamed a neighbor's fence line for a winter that would have killed him regardless." He did not say it to excuse Istaqa. He said it because he recognized, with sudden and uncomfortable clarity, how easily his own guilt could have hardened into the same kind of certainty. Istaqa sat down heavily on the shack's single stool, the fight gone out of him, replaced by something rawer and harder to carry, the exhaustion of a man who has spent weeks preparing for a battle that no longer exists. "I almost killed you last night," he admitted, voice barely above the crackle of the fire. "In the snow, before you carried her inside. I had the arrow drawn." Quill did not flinch at the confession, only nodded slowly, as though some part of him had already sensed how close that night had come to a different ending. "Why didn't you?" Quill asked, not as accusation but as genuine question, the kind 2 men ask each other only after the worst has already passed them by. Istaqa looked toward Odessa, still and silent on the cot, then back to Quill. "Because you gave away the only warmth you had," he said, "to someone who owed you nothing, expecting nothing back. My father used to say a man's true face shows itself in winter, when kindness costs something. I saw your true face last night. It was not the face I came here to kill. Peace, when it comes after violence has already been planned, rarely arrives clean. It was Odessa who first heard the horses, faint at first, then unmistakable, cutting through the settling snow from the east. Quill crossed to the shack's single window and felt his stomach drop at what he saw. 4 riders, approaching at an easy, confident pace, red bandanas knotted at their throats, rifles resting across their saddles, the way men carry weapons when they don't expect resistance. "The Larkin gang," Quill said, and Istaqa was on his feet instantly, bow off his shoulder, 3 arrows already gripped loose in his other hand. "They burn what they don't own," Istaqa said grimly, "and they're not done burning." The gang had drifted this direction all winter, emboldened by a territory too thinly policed to stop them, and Quill understood in an instant why they'd come. Word had likely reached them of a widow alone on the road, an easy target for men who mistook cruelty for entertainment. There was no time for a plan more complicated than the one instinct provided. Quill checked his revolver, 6 rounds, no more, while Istaqa moved to the shack's rear window, testing the angle for a clean shot through the gap. Odessa, pale but resolute, pulled herself upright off the cot, refusing the fate of hiding helpless while two men fought for her. "There's a hatchet by the stove," she said, voice steadier than either man expected. "I know how to use it. My father was a butcher before he was a fool with land deeds." The riders reined up 30 yards out, close enough now that Quill recognized the lead man's voice, Silas Larkin himself, the gang's rotten root, calling out with mock politeness that fooled no one in that shack. "Morning, friends. Heard tell there's a woman traveling alone out this way. Awful dangerous. A woman alone." Istaqa's arrow was already knocked before Larkin finished the sentence. His earlier fury at Quill transformed now into something aimed at its rightful target, sharp and certain in a way 3 weeks of misdirected hatred had never let it be. "She's not alone," Quill called back through the door, revolver steady in his hand, despite fingers still stiff from frostbite. Larkin laughed, low and ugly, and gestured his men to spread wide around the shack, the practiced movement of men who had done this before and expected the same easy outcome. What Larkin did not know, could not have known, was that the two men he now faced had spent the entire night deciding, independently and against every instinct of grief and guilt, to trust each other instead of destroy each other. That decision, made in the coldest hours before dawn, was about to become the only thing standing between Odessa Marrow and a fate worse than the storm she'd already survived. Istaqa's arrow found the string's full draw. Quill's thumb found the revolver's hammer. And in the space of a single held breath, the morning's fragile peace shattered into something that would decide, once and for all, who these two men had chosen to become. The first shot came from Larkin's rifle, splintering the doorframe an inch from Quill's shoulder, and the shack erupted into chaos. Istaqa's arrow took the nearest rider clean through the arm before he could level his own weapon, the man tumbling from his horse with a scream swallowed by snow. Quill fired twice through the gap in the door, driving Larkin's second man back behind his mount, buying seconds that felt like hours in the freezing air. Odessa, hatchet gripped white-knuckled in both hands, stationed herself at the shack's rear door, refusing to be the helpless thing men so often assumed a widow to be. When a third rider circled wide, thinking to breach the back of the shack unguarded, he found instead a woman who had buried a husband 2 days prior and had nothing left to lose, and he retreated faster than he'd advanced, unwilling to test what desperation might do with a blade in a woman's hand. Larkin himself pressed forward on foot now, rifle raised, close enough that Quill could see the cruelty etched plain across his face. A man who had burned homes for sport and never once paid for it, certain this morning would end the same easy way all his mornings had. He was wrong. Istaqa, out of arrows, dropped his bow and closed the distance on foot with a speed that startled even Quill, tackling Larkin into the snow before the rifle could rise a final time. The fight that followed was short and brutal, the kind that settles not on skill but on which man has more left to lose. Istaqa fought with 3 weeks of misdirected grief finally aimed true, with his mother's memory driving every strike, and Larkin, used to victims who cowered, not warriors who charged, found himself pinned and disarmed within a dozen violent seconds. Quill arrived a heartbeat later, revolver leveled at Larkin's head, and the remaining riders, seeing their leader beaten and bleeding in the snow, chose the better part of cowardice and fled east without him. It was over as quickly as it had begun, the silence afterward somehow louder than the gunfire had been. Odessa emerged from the shack, hatchet still in hand, and found the two men standing over a beaten Larkin, breathing hard, snow melting pink beneath him from a cut Istaqa's fist had opened above his eye. "He'll answer to the territorial marshal in Cheyenne," Quill said, hauling Larkin up by the collar. "For the fire and for every barn before it." Larkin said nothing, defeated in a way cruelty rarely allows itself to be defeated, publicly and by the very people it had underestimated. Istaqa stood in the settling quiet afterward, looking down at his bloodied knuckles, feeling something loosen in his chest that had been wound tight since the night of the fire. The vengeance he had hunted for 3 weeks had found its true target after all, not through the arrow he'd nearly loosed at an innocent man, but through the friendship that arrow's mercy had accidentally made possible. He looked up and found Quill watching him with something that had no name yet, but felt, unmistakably, like the beginning of trust between two men. Grief had almost turned into enemies. The schoolhouse went up that spring on a plot of land at the base of Split Antler Ridge, built with lumber Quill donated and labor Istaqa's camp provided without being asked twice, a debt of gratitude neither side called a debt at all. Odessa Marrow taught its first class that autumn, 12 children, half from ranching families, half from the Apache camp that had once watched Quill's fence line with suspicion and now shared its border in something closer to kinship. She had stayed in the territory, unable to leave a place that had cost her everything, and then, impossibly, given something back. Larkin stood trial in Cheyenne that summer and was sentenced to 15 years for arson and attempted murder. His gang scattered to whatever corners of the territory would still have men like them. The fire that had once seemed an unpunishable cruelty became instead the crime that finally caught up with him, undone not by lawmen who had ignored it for months, but by two men it had nearly turned against each other. Istaqa testified against him without hesitation, his voice steady in a courtroom that had rarely, if ever, taken an Apache man's word as truth before that day. Quill's ranch prospered that year in ways it never had under a man who spoke only to cattle. He built a second cabin near the tree line, no longer content with walls that had no windows, and it was there, on quiet evenings, that Istaqa often sat with him, the two men trading stories of fathers lost too soon and mothers who deserved more than the world had given them. Their friendship never announced itself with speeches. It simply grew the way trust grows after a night that could have ended in death and chose, instead, to end in mercy. Odessa found her own quiet peace in the schoolhouse, teaching children whose grandparents' hatreds had once seemed as permanent as the mountains around them, watching those old lines soften a little more with every shared lesson. She never remarried, but she was rarely alone, not with Quill checking the schoolhouse woodpile every winter, out of the same old habit that had once left a lantern burning for lost travelers, and not with Istaqa's younger sisters among her most devoted students, giggling over letters they were only just learning to write. On the 1-year anniversary of the blizzard, the three of them climbed the ridge together to the spot where it had all nearly ended. Odessa collapsed in the snow, an arrow drawn on an innocent man's back, a coat given without expectation of return. They said little standing there, because little needed saying. Istaqa laid a small stone at the base of the lightning-split pine, a marker for his mother and quietly for the version of himself that had almost let vengeance win. Quill stood beside him in a new grey coat, the twin of the one still folded carefully in Odessa's trunk. The wind moved gently through the pines that day, nothing like the fury of a year before, and for a long moment the three of them simply stood together on the ridge, watching the sun catch the snow the way it had that terrible night, except now the light looked different, warmer somehow, though nothing about the mountain itself had changed. It was not the snow that had changed, it was them. And as they turned to walk back down toward the schoolhouse, the ranch, and the small, stubborn life they had built from a night that should have ended in death, none of them looked back because none of them needed to. What the blizzard had nearly taken, it had in the end given back tenfold. The end.